Everyone in Washington knew Senator Richard Caldwell was going places. At 45 years old, he had that perfect mix of silver hair at the temples and a $1 million smile that looked great on campaign posters. The media couldn't get enough of him. They called him the voice of reason because of his powerful speeches about law and order. But behind those perfect white teeth and designer suits was a man who grew up never having to wait for anything he wanted. Richard was born into money, old money. His grandfather had built a banking empire, and his father had doubled it. The Caldwell estate sat on 10 acres in the richest part of town, with a gate and guards that kept the rest of the world at a safe distance. As a boy, Richard never played with kids from the other side of town. His friends were the children of judges, business owners, and fellow politicians. His schools were private, expensive, and overwhelmingly white. When the family needed help around their massive house, they hired people from the poorer neighborhoods, people who Richard's father made sure knew their place. These experiences shaped Richard in ways he didn't even realize. By the time he ran for office, he had spent 40 years seeing the world through a very narrow window. He honestly believed some people were just born better than others. He was careful about saying these things out loud, of course. A politician needs votes from everyone, after all. "The senator has arrived," whispered his assistant as Richard walked through his office doors on a bright Monday morning. Staff members straightened their backs and fixed their smiles. When Richard Caldwell entered a room, everyone felt the shift in the air. "Morning, everyone," he said without making eye contact with any of the junior staffers. He saved his charm for people who mattered: donors, other politicians, and TV cameras. His chief of staff, a nervous man named Taylor, hurried alongside him. "Sir, you've got the budget committee at 9:30, lunch with the mayor at noon. And the police department wants to discuss the new funding bill at 3 o'clock. Richard stopped walking. "The police department? I thought we settled that." "They're still pushing for the community outreach program, sir." Richard sighed dramatically. "Fine, but keep it short. I've got that fundraiser tonight." Behind the scenes, Richard had been fighting against the police department's request for a program that would put more officers in lower-income neighborhoods, not for arrests, but to build trust and relationships. He thought it was a waste of money. "Those people don't vote anyway," he had once said in a private meeting. Later that day, Richard sat across from Police Chief Wilson, a tough, no-nonsense man who had worked his way up from walking a beat in the city's toughest areas. "Senator, we need this program," the chief explained. "It's not just about crime stats, it's about building trust." Richard gave his practiced political smile. "I understand your position, Chief, but we have limited resources. The taxpayers expect us to use their money wisely." What he didn't say was that his real donors, the wealthy business owners and corporate interests, wanted more police protecting their neighborhoods, not building relationships in communities Richard had never visited. After the meeting, Richard's assistant overheard him muttering, "What a waste of my time." As if those officers have anything useful to do besides writing tickets and making arrests. That evening, Richard attended a private dinner with his biggest supporters. In this circle of wealth and privilege, surrounded by people who looked and thought just like him, he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. "Between us," he said, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal glass, "I think we're being too soft on crime in certain areas. Some people only understand one language: force." The others nodded in agreement, none of them knowing that in just a few days, Senator Richard Caldwell would have an encounter that would shatter the carefully constructed image he had built over decades of privilege and power. The rain came down hard that Tuesday evening, turning the city streets slick and shiny under the streetlights. Senator Richard Caldwell was already in a foul mood. His secretary had spilled coffee on his favorite tie, the traffic was terrible, and now this downpour was making him late for the biggest fundraising dinner of the year. "Can't you go any faster?" he snapped at his driver. "Sorry, sir," the driver replied, gripping the steering wheel of the luxury black sedan tighter. "Roads are slippery, and there's a speed trap up ahead." Richard huffed and checked his watch again. "I've got donors waiting. People who actually matter in this town. Just get me there." The driver nodded silently and pressed the gas pedal a little harder. The car surged forward, cutting through the rain at nearly 20 miles over the speed limit. They didn't see the police cruiser tucked away in the shadow of an overpass. but the cruiser saw them. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed in the rearview mirror, and the wail of a siren cut through the drumming of rain on the car roof. "Don't stop," Richard ordered, not even looking up from his phone where he was typing out an angry message about being late. The driver's eyes widened. "Sir, that's a police car. I have to pull over." "Do you know who I am?" Richard's voice rose. "I vote on their budget." But the driver was already easing the car to the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in the gloom. Richard threw himself back against the leather seat, fury building inside him like a pressure cooker. Through the side mirror, he watched a figure approach. The officer was wearing a raincoat over his uniform, water streaming down from his hat as he walked carefully along the roadside. Richard lowered his window just enough to speak. "License and registration, please," came the officer's deep, professional voice. Richard peered through the crack in the window and felt his mood darken even further when he saw the officer was black. Officer Thomas was a 12-year veteran of the force, though Richard didn't know or care about that. "Do you have any idea who you've pulled over?" Richard asked coldly, making no move to comply with the request. Officer Thomas leaned down slightly, his face remaining neutral and professional. "No, sir, I don't. But I clocked your vehicle going 68 in a 45 zone. License and registration, please." The driver tried to reach for the glove compartment, but Richard stopped him with a sharp gesture. "I'm Senator Richard Caldwell," he said, as if announcing he was royalty. "I'm late for an important state function. Surely we can overlook this minor issue." Rain continued to pour down on Officer Thomas, but his stance didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. I still need to see your license and the vehicle registration." Something snapped in Richard. The stress of the day, the rain, being late, and now this man. This officer who didn't seem impressed by his title, it was all too much. "Listen here," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I help decide your salary. I'm on my way to meet people who run this city, real people, important people." Officer Thomas's expression didn't change. "Sir, refusing to provide your license and registration is a violation of state law. Please comply, or I'll have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." The rage that had been building in Richard suddenly boiled over. Words came out of his mouth that he usually kept hidden away, saved for private country club conversations and closed-door meetings. Ugly words. Words about Officer Thomas's race, about where he belonged, about how he should know his place. The driver's face went pale. He stared straight ahead, pretending not to hear as his boss unleashed a torrent of racist insults at the officer. Through it all, Officer Thomas stood straight, his face giving away nothing. The rain soaked through his uniform jacket now, but he didn't flinch, didn't react. He waited for the tirade to end with the patience of someone who had heard it all before. What Senator Richard Caldwell didn't know, what he couldn't see through his cloud of rage and privilege, was that his car's dashboard camera was recording everything, every word, every insult, every threat. And in just 24 hours, the whole world would hear them too. Officer Thomas took a slow, deep breath as the senator's cruel words hum in the rain-soaked air between them. In his 12 years on the force, he'd faced down armed suspects and talked people off ledges, but sometimes these traffic stops took more courage than anything else. "Sir," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the storm both around and directed at him, "I'm going to ask you one more time for your license and registration." Richard's face had turned an angry shade of red. "You're really pushing it, aren't you? Do you know how many friends I have in your department? Your chief had lunch with me yesterday, begging for budget approval." The senator's driver, a middle-aged man named Hank who had worked for the Caldwell family for nearly a decade, slowly reached for the glove compartment, his movements careful like someone trying not to startle a dangerous animal. "Don't you dare," Richard snapped at him. "Sir, please," Hank whispered. "Let's just handle this and get to the dinner." But Richard wasn't listening. Years of getting his way, of people stepping aside when he walked into a room, had created a man who couldn't process being told no, especially by someone he considered beneath him. "You know what?" Richard leaned toward the window crack. "I want your badge number. I want your supervisor's name. By this time tomorrow, you'll be directing traffic at school crossings, if you still have a job at all." Officer Thomas pulled out his notepad, unfazed by the threat. "My badge number is 4731. My supervisor is Lieutenant Rivera. Would you like his phone number as well?" This calm response only fueled Richard's anger. "You think I'm joking? I sit on committees that decide police funding for this entire state. People like you should show some respect to people like me." The "people like you" hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Inside the car, Hank winced and stared straight ahead. The dashboard camera's small red light blinked steadily, capturing every word. Officer Thomas wrote something in his notepad, his pen moving across the wet paper. "Since you're refusing to provide your documentation, I'll need you to step out of the vehicle, sir." "I will do no such thing." Richard's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Do you have any idea the people who will be calling your chief when they hear about this? I'm personal friends with the governor." Officer Thomas nodded slightly. "I understand, sir. But the law applies to everyone equally, even senators, even friends of the governor." Something in the officer's calm, professional demeanor finally penetrated Richard's rage. He realized that his outburst wasn't working, that this officer wasn't going to be intimidated. With a disgusted grunt, he nodded to Hank, who quickly produced the car's registration from the glove compartment. Richard pulled his wallet from his jacket and practically threw his license at the officer. Officer Thomas took both documents and returned to his cruiser to run the information. Inside the police car, he took another deep breath, his hands slightly shaking now that he was alone. He'd heard those words before, but they still cut deep. Still, he had a job to do. When he returned to the senator's car 5 minutes later, he was completely professional as he handed back the license along with the ticket. "This is a citation for speeding, Senator Caldwell. You were going 23 miles over the posted limit in rainy conditions. The court date is listed at the bottom if you wish to contest it." Richard snatched the ticket, tearing it slightly. "Oh, I'll contest it all right. And when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never seen my car tonight." Officer Thomas stepped back from the vehicle. "Drive safely, sir. Please reduce your speed, especially in these weather conditions." As the luxury sedan pulled away, spraying dirty water onto Officer Thomas's uniform, the officer stood in the rain for a moment longer. He didn't know that the dashboard camera had caught everything. He didn't know that the senator's assistant would find the footage. He didn't know that in less than a day, millions of people would witness this encounter. He just knew that it had been a long shift, and he still had 4 hours to go. With a weary sigh, he walked back to his cruiser, radio crackling with the next call. Another day, another storm to weather. 3 days after the rainy night traffic stop, Diane walked into her office at the state capitol building and set down her coffee mug. As Senator Caldwell's personal assistant for the past 2 years, she'd learned to come in early to prepare for his demands before he arrived. Her job included many tasks, one being to manage the senator's car service records. The dashboard camera footage was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud account that she checked weekly. Today was her scheduled day to review any new footage and clear the storage. She opened her laptop and clicked through to the secure folder. There was a new video from Tuesday night, the night of the big fundraiser when the senator had arrived late and in a terrible mood. Diane clicked on it, thinking nothing of it. She often had to check these videos for insurance purposes or to document travel times. The video began playing, showing a rain-streaked windshield and wipers sweeping back and forth. She heard the senator complaining about being late, then saw the police lights flash in the rearview mirror. She reached for her coffee, expecting nothing interesting. But then she heard it. As the officer approached and spoke, Senator Caldwell's voice changed. The words that came out of his mouth made her freeze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. "Did he just say that?" she whispered to the empty office. She rewound the video and played it again. There was no mistake. The words were clear, despite the rain and the partially lowered window. Her boss, Senator Richard Caldwell, champion of equal opportunity in his public speeches, was spewing hateful, racist insults at a police officer who was simply doing his job. Diane felt sick. As a woman of color herself, she had sometimes wondered about certain comments the senator had made, certain people he seemed to avoid meeting with. But she had given him the benefit of the doubt. Now there was no doubt left. She watched the entire video twice more. Each time, her hands trembled a little more. The officer's professionalism in the face of such abuse was remarkable. The senator's threats to have him fired were clear. It was all there. Diane glanced at the clock. She had about an hour before anyone else would arrive. Her mind raced with thoughts about what to do. If I show this to HR, will they even care? The senator's too powerful, she mumbled to herself. If I do nothing, I'm part of the problem. She had grown up watching her parents face discrimination. Her father, despite having a master's degree, had been passed over for promotions. Her mother had taught her to always stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. With shaking hands, Diane took out her personal phone. She created a new email account using a fake name. Then she downloaded a copy of the video file. This isn't about politics, she told herself. This is about basic human decency. She attached the video to an email and sent it to 3 local news stations and 2 popular social media accounts known for covering political news. In the email, she wrote simply, "Senator Richard Caldwell during a traffic stop on Tuesday night. The public deserves to know who represents them." Then she deleted the evidence of what she'd done from her phone, closed the video on her work computer, and tried to calm her racing heart. By lunchtime, her phone was buzzing with news alerts. By 2 o'clock, the video was trending nationwide. By 3, the senator's office was fielding hundreds of calls. Diane sat at her desk, answering those calls with a professional voice that betrayed none of her feelings. "Senator Caldwell's office, how may I help you?" She repeated over and over as the word spread and the outrage grew. From her desk, she could see into the senator's office, where he was pacing back and forth, face red, occasionally shouting into his phone. The chief of staff and the communications director had rushed in, both looking panicked. "Who leaked this? Who leaked this?" The senator's voice boomed through the door. Diane kept her face perfectly neutral as she transferred another angry caller to voicemail. No one looked at the quiet assistant who had finally decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. No one suspected that she had just changed the course of a powerful man's career with a single email. And outside the government building, a crowd was beginning to gather, their signs hastily made but their message clear. They had seen the true Richard Caldwell, and they had seen enough. The morning after the video leaked, Senator Richard Caldwell woke up to a nightmare. His phone had been ringing nonstop since 5 a.m. His press secretary had called 12 times. The governor, once his close ally, had left a message saying they needed to talk immediately. Richard grabbed the TV remote with shaking hands and turned on the news. His own face filled the screen. A still image from the dashboard camera video, his mouth twisted in anger, eyes narrowed with hate. "No, no, no," he whispered as the news anchor's voice filled his bedroom. The video, which has now been viewed over 3 million times, shows Senator Caldwell using racial slurs against an officer during a routine traffic stop. Warning to our viewers, the language in this clip is disturbing. Richard watched in horror as his own words played back for all the world to hear. They cut the worst parts for the morning broadcast, but the bleeped-out sections only made it clear how bad the full version was. His phone rang again. This time it was his campaign manager. "Tell me how to fix this," Richard demanded instead of saying hello. There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "Sir, I've been in politics for 30 years. I've handled scandals before. But this is bad. Really bad." It was taken out of context, Richard insisted, pacing his bedroom in his silk pajamas. "I was stressed. I was late for an important event. The officer was being difficult. Sir, with all due respect, there is no context where those words are acceptable, especially not from an elected official." "Then what do I do?" Richard's voice cracked. For the first time in years, he felt actual fear. "We're preparing a statement. A denial won't work. The video is too clear. We're going with deeply regrets his actions and not reflective of his character." Richard nodded, then remembered he was on the phone. Good. And this will blow over, right? These things always do." The silence on the other end lasted too long. "Right?" Richard pressed. "Sir, I need to be honest with you. The party leadership has already called. They're distancing themselves. Your biggest donors are pulling out. The police union has released a statement condemning your actions." Richard felt his legs go weak. He sank onto the edge of his bed. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." "There's more," his campaign manager continued reluctantly. The officer in the video, Officer Thomas, is being hailed as a hero for his professional response. His personnel file was leaked somehow. Turns out he's a decorated veteran, saved a family from a burning car last year, runs a youth program in his spare time. The public is falling in love with him, and the manager didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Richard knew what came next, and they're hating me. After hanging up, Richard tried to pull himself together. He had a press conference in 2 hours where he would read the statement his team had prepared. He would look appropriately sorry. He would talk about stress and momentary lapses. He was good at looking sincere when needed. But as he stepped out of his front door, he froze. At least 50 reporters crowded his normally quiet, exclusive street. Camera flashes exploded in his face. Shouted questions hit him like physical blows. "Senator, did you mean what you said to Officer Thomas? Senator, have you spoken to community leaders about your comments? Senator, are you planning to resign?" That last question cut through the noise. Resign? After all he'd worked for? After all the deals and compromises and ladder climbing? His driver tried to clear a path to the waiting car, but it was slow going. Then Richard saw something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the reporters were ordinary people holding signs. Racism, KK's, no place in OFFIC, read one. Resign and Abu demanded another. As his car finally pulled away, Richard looked back at his beautiful home, his manicured lawn, his life of privilege. For the first time, he wondered if it might all be slipping away. All because of one traffic stop. All because he had shown the world who he really was, behind the polished speeches and practiced smiles. The thought made his stomach turn. Because deep down, in a place he rarely looked, Richard knew the truth. This wasn't about one bad night or one moment of stress. This was about who he had always been. 1 week after the dashboard camera video went viral, Senator Richard Caldwell sat alone in his home office. Empty coffee cups and half-eaten meals littered the desk. The blinds were drawn tight against the reporters who still camped outside his gate. His press conference had been a disaster. He tried to look sorry, to say all the right words about regrettable language and momentary lapse in judgment. But the cameras caught the insincerity in his eyes. Social media users slowed down the footage, pointing out how he couldn't even fake a believable apology. The phone on his desk rang. Richard stared at it, then reluctantly picked up. It was Congressman Wilson, once his closest ally in Washington. "Richard," the congressman said, his voice unusually formal. "I'm calling as a courtesy. The party leadership is issuing a statement in an hour. They're asking for your resignation." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "They can't force me out. I was elected by the people. Those same people are calling for your head, Richard. Your approval rating is at 7%. 7. The congressman sighed. "Look, this isn't just about the video anymore." "What do you mean?" Richard felt a new kind of dread forming. Reporters are digging. They found 3 former staffers who filed complaints about racial discrimination. Complaints that mysteriously disappeared. They found recordings of you at private fundraisers. Things you said when you thought no one outside the room would hear. Richard closed his eyes. Those private events where donors paid $10,000 a plate to hear what politicians really thought. Where waitstaff, mostly people of color, were treated like they were invisible as they served drinks and food. "It's a witch hunt," Richard said weakly. "No, Richard, it's accountability." The congressman's voice hardened. "And there's more. That police officer you threatened? Officer Thomas. Turns out he's not just any cop. He's been decorated twice for bravery. He mentors kids in the very neighborhoods you voted to cut funding for. His own son was a victim of racial profiling last year." The weight of it all pressed down on Richard's chest like a stone. His political instincts, honed over decades, told him this was a fight he couldn't win. "What happens if I don't resign?" he asked, though he already knew. "The party will publicly condemn you. They'll support your opponent in the next election. Committee assignments. Gone. Campaign funding. Gone. You'll be political poison, Richard." After hanging up, Richard walked to his window and peered through the blinds. The crowd outside had grown. Signs waved in the air. Chants rose and fell. His home phone rang again. This time it was a reporter from the Times. Senator, we've obtained emails showing you personally blocked funding for community policing programs in predominantly black neighborhoods. Would you care to comment? Richard hung up without answering. His personal phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, who lived across the country. Dad, what have you done? My friends are asking me if my father is a racist. I don't know what to tell them. He put the phone down, hands shaking. The carefully constructed walls that had protected him were crumbling, one by one. His assistant Diane, who had been unusually quiet all week, knocked on his office door. She entered without waiting for his response, something she had never done before. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Richard looked up, surprised. I'm not taking visitors. You know that. It's Lieutenant Rivera, sir. Officer Thomas's supervisor. Richard felt a chill run through him. What does he want? Diane's eyes were cool, professional. He says he has a proposal, something that might help both sides move forward. Richard almost laughed. What could possibly fix this situation? Send him in, he said finally. What did he have to lose? Lieutenant Rivera entered, tall and composed in his uniform. Behind him came a familiar face, Officer Thomas himself. The man Richard had insulted, threatened, and demeaned now stood in his office, back straight, eyes clear and direct. There was no hatred in those eyes, just a steady, assessing gaze that seemed to see right through Richard's expensive suit to the frightened man beneath. Senator Caldwell, Officer Thomas said with a slight nod. I think it's time we had a real conversation. For a long moment, the only sound in Senator Caldwell's office was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Richard stared at Officer Thomas, the man he had insulted and threatened in the rain just days ago. Now that same man stood in his office, calm and composed. Please, sit down, Lieutenant Rivera said, gesturing to the chairs across from Richard's desk. The lieutenant took a seat, but Officer Thomas remained standing. I prefer to stand, thank you, he said quietly. Richard cleared his throat. If you're here to see me grovel, you've wasted a trip. My lawyers advised me not to. We're not here for an apology, Officer Thomas cut in. His voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact. Those words you said to me, I've heard them before, many times, from people with much less power than you. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're here with a different proposal, Lieutenant Rivera explained. The community is angry. You've lost the public's trust. But yelling and shaming rarely changes hearts. Officer Thomas finally took a seat, leaning forward slightly. I run a program at the community center on West Side. Kids from tough neighborhoods learn about law enforcement, community involvement, conflict resolution. They need to see that justice can work, even when it's someone powerful who did wrong. Richard frowned. What exactly are you suggesting? Restorative justice, Lieutenant Rivera said. Instead of just resigning in disgrace, you agree to meet with community members you've hurt through your policies and words. You listen to their experiences. You learn. And why would I do that? Richard asked, but his voice had lost its usual edge. Officer Thomas looked him straight in the eyes. Because deep down, you know your career is over. The only question is whether you leave as just another disgraced politician or as someone who at least tried to understand the damage he's done. The truth of those words hit Richard hard. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a glass of water. The meeting would be televised, Lieutenant Rivera added. The public has seen the worst of you. They deserve to see if there's anything better. 3 weeks later, Richard sat on a stage at the community center. Lights and cameras surrounded him. Across from him sat Officer Thomas, along with 5 community members, people from neighborhoods Richard had never visited despite representing them for years. For 2 hours he listened, really listened, maybe for the first time in his life. A grandmother told him about raising her grandchildren after her son was given a harsh sentence for a minor offense under laws Richard had supported. A teacher described how budget cuts Richard had championed had eliminated arts and after-school programs. A young man explained how being stopped by police 10 times in 1 year had affected his mental health. And Officer Thomas shared something Richard hadn't known, that his own father had been beaten by police in the 1960s for sitting at a whites-only lunch counter. Halfway through, something unexpected happened. Richard started crying, not the practiced single tear down the cheek of political apologies. real tears that made his voice shake and his nose run. I was raised to believe some lives mattered more than others, he admitted, his carefully crafted image finally crumbling completely. I never questioned it. I never had to. The system worked for me, so I assumed it worked for everyone who deserved it to work. When the cameras stopped rolling, Richard approached Officer Thomas privately. "I still don't understand everything," he said honestly, "but I want to." Officer Thomas nodded. "That's a start." In the months that followed, Richard Caldwell did resign from office. His political career was over. But something else began. He started volunteering at Officer Thomas's youth program. Awkwardly at first, then with growing comfort. He used his connections to bring in funding. He spoke to his wealthy friends about what he was learning. Some people called it a publicity stunt. Others said it was too little, too late. But the kids at the center didn't care about politics. They just knew that the old guy who helped with their homework had some interesting stories about how people can change if they're brave enough to try. And Officer Thomas, he got promoted to captain. The dashboard camera footage is now used in police training across the country, a perfect example of how to maintain professionalism in the face of abuse. Sometimes karma doesn't just punish. Sometimes, if we're lucky, it teaches.